Well, my name is DURWOOD ZAELKE. I'm often described as a grizzled veteran of the climate wars. And I'm a serial entrepreneur, having started various non-governmental organizations and educational institutions at American University, Washington College of Law, and at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the Brin School of Environmental Science and Management. My current group, the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, focuses on fast climate mitigation. Our mission is really summed up in two words: time and temperature. We have too high of a temperature and we have too little time to turn it back down and restore the climate system to its safe and more natural state. When you focus on time and temperature, temperature and time, you see that there are two basic forces causing climate change. One is carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuel. But when you look at how you turn that off by decarbonizing the world and shifting to clean energy, you see that you actually cause warming for the first 10 years because you're shutting off not just CO2 when you move from a power plant to clean energy, but you're also shutting off the co-emitted cooling sulfates. Those sulfates fall out of the atmosphere very quickly, days to weeks to a few months, and they expose warming that's already in the system. And CO2, of course, lasts for a very long time. Probably 25 to 40% last for 500 years or more. So turning that knob to turn down fossil fuel emissions doesn't give you the opportunity for cutting warming in the near term. In fact, at the 20-year mark, it's a wash. No net warming, no net cooling, and it's not until 2050 that turning down the fossil fuel knob gives you about 0.1 degrees Celsius of avoided warming. It starts kicking in at 2060, and it's absolutely essential to do, starting now, of course, and accelerating now. But it doesn't slow down the near-term warming. So then you look at the other side of what's causing climate, and that's the non-CO2, generally short-lived superclimate pollutants. These include HFCs, hydrofluorocarbon refrigerants. They include black carbon soot. They include tropospheric ozone, or ground-level smog, and they include methane. Now, our first mission was to get rid of the HFC superpollutant refrigerants because we had the perfect treaty to do that, the Montreal Protocol. Now, this treaty was designed originally to protect stratospheric ozone, but because the same chemicals that destroy stratospheric ozone also cause climate warming, we thought, let's make this more explicit and put the HFC superpollutants into the Montreal Protocol. They were in the Kyoto basket of gases that you're allowed to trade with, the 6, now 7 gases. But the UNFCCC regulates emissions, and the Montreal Protocol says, these are factory-made gases. Let's go upstream and regulate production and consumption. So our mission at my group, the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, or IGSD, was to amend the Montreal Protocol to phase out the HFCs. We did that after a very long, multi-year campaign, culminated in the Kigali Amendment in Kigali, Rwanda, in October 2016. And that single action will avoid nearly 0.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So at the time, it was the single biggest bite ever taken out of future warming. Now, just a little more history on the Montreal Protocol. So people know this treaty because it's put the stratospheric ozone layer on the path to recovery by 2065. And that's prevented skin cancer, cataracts, reduced immune systems in humans and animals. Hugely successful. Every country of the world is a party. Every country of the world has been largely in compliance, and as a result, that treaty has phased out nearly 100 damaging chemicals by nearly 100%. And because those same chemicals are climate-forcing chemicals as well as ozone depleting, the Montreal Protocol has done more to solve climate change than any other agreement. In fact, it has avoided warming that otherwise would be equal to what CO2 is causing today. The Montreal Protocol has avoided warming that would equal what carbon dioxide causes today. And carbon dioxide causes about half of all warming. So this is a pretty damn good treaty. And we decided we could use it to go even further in its climate protection by phasing down the HFC refrigerants. So after that, the next big target is methane. And methane now is in everybody's gun sights because as the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to reduce short-lived climate pollutants has calculated, this is a calculation by Dr. Drew Schindel at Duke University, the effort to reduce methane can avoid nearly 0.3 degrees Celsius of future warming by the 2040s. So it's now the single biggest and fastest way to slow future warming in the near term. Now let me just back up for a second, and I know you guys can edit this any way you want, but why does speed matter? So I focus on feedbacks in the climate system, the self-reinforcing feedbacks, and the tipping points that those feedbacks are pushing us past. The best illustration of a feedback is the Arctic sea ice, this great white shield that currently sends a lot of incoming solar radiation safely back to space. And we've lost about half of it. By extent, we've lost much, much more in terms of volume. In fact, we're down to just a few percent of the strong multi-year ice. And there is a calculation by Pistone, Eisenman, and Ramanathan that says when we lose the remaining half of the Arctic sea ice and its reflective force, we'll add the equivalent of 1 trillion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. That's 25 years worth of current emissions and about half of the total that the world has put into the atmosphere since pre-industrial times, which is 2.4 trillion. Now that's if cloud cover doesn't dissipate, because if the clouds also dissipate, then we could be seeing maybe 3 times that amount, 3 trillion. And Peter Wadhams, the great scientist for the Arctic at Cambridge University, reminds me always when I'm making a presentation on the Arctic sea ice that land-based snow and ice in the Arctic is also melting. We're losing that albedo or reflective force, and we're probably adding an equal amount of warming from that as we are from the loss of the sea ice. So then the question is, how fast is that going to happen? Well, the scientists who are the empirical-based scientists, the ones who actually observe what's happening, say this could occur within 10 to 15 years. If that happens, we will see the permafrost in the northern regions of the world collapse, and that will release more methane, another super climate pollutant, N2O, and carbon dioxide. So that's a second self-reinforcing feedback that we'll see. And that will start a wicked cascade that will destroy the boreal forest. It'll change the way the jet stream meanders and allow the heat domes to park themselves over places like the Pacific Northwest for long periods of time. It'll change the thermohaline heat conveyor that now keeps Europe at a temperate climate. And we'll see climate chaos. So protecting the Arctic becomes one of the most important things we can do. And if you cut the package of super climate pollutants, you can cut the rate of warming in the Arctic by 2/3. So that's an incredible down payment on protecting the Arctic. It's not enough. We need to do other things. Sir David King has researched this at his effort. Dr. Leslie Fields is another leading proponent for enhancing albedo in the Arctic using silica beads that'll add reflectivity or albedo. And we need to pioneer those strategies right now to slow down the loss of the Arctic sea ice. So time and temperature, and the time is so short to protect the Arctic and slow these feedbacks. Amazon is another feedback. We've destroyed 17% of the Amazon, and Carlos Nobre and Tom Lovejoy calculate that when we hit 20%, maybe 25%, the Amazon will then destroy itself, the remaining part. It'll destroy itself. And that will turn what is now an incredible sink that pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere into a source that puts it back into the atmosphere. And at the same time, it'll destroy the weather system for most of Latin America. So these are very, very dangerous things that are happening. Other scientists calculate that we face, when we hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we're likely to hit within 5 years, we will face 11 tipping points that are irreversible and potentially catastrophic. So we need to speed things up. Right now, we're chasing a fast problem with slow solutions. Indeed, we're chasing an accelerating problem with slow solutions. So slow success is no success. We need to find ways to speed up climate mitigation. We need to focus more on adaptation and resilience. And then ultimately, we need to find a way to restore the climate to its past safe and stable state. Jim Hansen, of course, was one of the leading proponents of this with his early paper that said 350 parts per million of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere is probably the maximum that the planet can tolerate and keep civilization safe and stable. We're at about 420 parts per million right now. Now, others like Peter Furkowski say, if we can go back to 350, let's keep going, because pre-industrial levels were about 280 parts per million. Let's go back, let's keep going, make the climate even safer and more resilient. Now, how do you do that? Well, there are brilliant strategies, and I usually describe this as a series of races. So you have to win the sprint to 2030 by cutting the super pollutants and stopping near-term warming, slowing down the feedbacks, and avoiding as many of the tipping points as you can. That's essential. You have to win that sprint. Then you have to win the marathon to 2050, which is the shift from fossil fuels to clean energy. Maybe we can do it even faster than 2050, but 2050 is the target most countries have set. Then you have to win the ultra marathon, which is taking CO2 and methane out of the atmosphere faster than the natural cycle. That's climate restoration. And that can be done. We know the physics, we know the chemistry. Now we need to put our technological genius to work and figure out how to do it at scale, at speed, and at some reasonable cost. But what's a reasonable cost when you're talking about saving the planet? I mean, we need to put trillions into our climate solutions, not billions, but trillions.
Just as a simple reference for this. So what you've just talked about, and forgive my ignorance here, but being involved in governance and also being an entrepreneur, and facing the time challenges that we have, where is the compromise, or if there is a compromise in there?
You know, I think the days for compromise are over. I mean, we're in an all-out war. I mean, we're facing, you know, an invasion of the enemy on our shores throughout the world, and so no, I don't think compromise is a good concept right now. But how do we manage to move forward against interests like the entrenched fossil fuel interest? How do we find the way to build a governance system? And we're, you know, you're seeing it percolate up from the youth movement. You know, you're seeing the new technologies give us more courage for solutions, hugely important. And then you see successes like Biden's recent successes in the U.S., where despite Republican opposition, he's managed to pass the CHIPS Act, he's managed to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, he's managed to put $370 billion just in that Inflation Reduction Act into play for climate mitigation. So it puts the U.S. back in a position where they can exert some leadership. Europe has often been ahead in climate leadership. We hope the new Prime Minister in the UK doesn't go backwards. Well, we'll see how that works. And of course, Europe is facing a real challenge with Russia cutting off Nord Stream 1 and the supply of gas to regions, especially Germany, that have become dependent on that gas. And so what we don't want to see is backsliding as the world scrambles to find natural gas, which is methane. Methane is the primary component of natural gas. In fact, it's not natural gas, it's fossil gas. And so we have to make sure that the fossil gas that is being put together to replace what Putin is restricting commits itself to low methane intensity. That gas has got to be provided with restrictions on methane leaks, methane flaring. It's hugely important. And that's the beginning of what should be a global methane agreement. So we should take inspiration from the Montreal Protocol, the world's best environmental treaty, and indeed the world's best treaty for climate as well, having solved an amount of climate equal to what CO2 causes today, and use that inspiration to design a governance system for reducing methane. And we need to do that quickly. We need to borrow the key architecture from the Montreal Protocol. That includes a robust scientific assessment panel. Well, in fact, we have such a panel within the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, the Paris-based group within UNEP, and that's led by Dr. Drew Shindell. We need to strengthen that. Then we need to create, again, borrowing from the Montreal Protocol, a technology and economic assessment panel so that we can assess all solutions basically in real time and give authoritative advice to all countries on how to reduce methane. That's what the Montreal Protocol does with substitutes for the ozone and climate warming chemicals that it regulates. Then we need to encourage all countries to designate methane officers or liaisons. Again, the Montreal Protocol does this with what they call national ozone units, which means in every developing country, 147, there are smart people who know how to do their job and keep that treaty on course. It has phased out nearly 100 damaging chemicals by nearly 100% in its 33, now 34 years of operation. So it's a governance system we need to study, respect, and emulate. The methane treaty should also include methane removal. So if we can perfect the chemistry and the physics that we know how to do for methane removal, that could be the single most important lever, along with methane mitigation, to cool the world in the near term. And that's essential on the way to decarbonization, the ultramarathon, and to learning how to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere as well, and returning to some safe level, somewhere south of 350, aiming for 280 parts per million. Okay, what else?
You listened to, I mean, there was a paper published last year, I think it was, Scientist Warnings into Action. I don't know if you read that paper. But, you know, there's all these documents that come out, there's these initiatives by scientists, and then the negotiation starts, and if there's any upside to a catastrophe, it's when people actually experience something and they suddenly wake up to that, as opposed to it being some kind of abstract. I don't know what my question is really, but how do we get around this negotiating as the house is burning with industry?
So when I was starting my effort in 2006 to strengthen the Montreal Protocol explicitly for climate purposes, I went to Cairo to visit the father of the Montreal Protocol, a brilliant Egyptian scientist, Mustafa Tolba, who was also the first head of UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. And he left me after a very gracious 4-hour lunch with 2 takeaway messages. And the first one is that science matters this much. And I took that to mean, as he intended, that it was never enough to solve a climate or an ozone problem, but was a key piece of the foundation. But it's not enough. His second message was that the Montreal Protocol was a start and strengthen treaty. We started modestly, we gained confidence by doing, and we moved faster and faster and further over the history of this agreement. So scientists can't solve climate change. I mean, if they could, we would not be here talking today. We'd be living in a safe climate. But science alone is not sufficient. So you see scientists now saying, we need to be activists. We need to go out and block pipelines. We need to glue ourselves to the door of the banks that are still funding further fossil fuel expansion, that are going to leave stranded assets while they kill the planet. So climate scientists are beginning to shift their role. And of course, you have to understand, too, that scientists rely so much on climate models. You know, if the phenomena is not well characterized in a model, then scientists and many policymakers think that they can ignore it. And in fact, that's a reckless thing to do, because some of the most important phenomena, like the feedbacks, are not well characterized in climate models. And feedbacks are probably the most dangerous phenomena now for the climate system. And so you have to be able to look out the window and see what the weather is. I mean, this is what Peter Wadhams at Cambridge does. You know, he goes to the Arctic. I think he's made 60 expeditions. And this guy can tell you what's happening there. And it's truly, truly frightening. So the scientists are not alone able to solve climate, although they're a key piece of the foundation, of course. They've been warning us, you know, since the 1960s. And then, of course, you have oil companies like Exxon who deliberately lied, hidden the truth, even though their own scientists had calculated exactly what their product was doing. I mean, their scientists said carbon dioxide from burning our product will potentially cause catastrophic impacts in the future. And they calculated quite accurately, using much less sophisticated computer models, when we'd hit 400 parts per million. But they didn't act. Instead, they hid that fact, and they hired people from the tobacco industry who'd confused the public, blamed the public for smoking when they were putting more and more nicotine in their product to get people addicted, Well, that's what the fossil fuel industry was doing. They were trying to keep the public addicted to their product, to fossil fuels. So even though the scientists told us a long time ago, it's not enough to get around always the money and power of the vested interest. So let's find something a little more optimistic here. I mean, as the yogurt hits the fan, so the climate impacts now are so intense in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in California, in the whole southwest of the United States, experiencing a drought beyond anything in 11 centuries, as Lake Mead dries up, as the Colorado River stops flowing, and this is all over the world. The leaders have got to move this up on their agenda as a key part of governance. They won't survive in office, which is generally their goal, unless they address the economy, national security, and now climate change. Because climate is going to trump national security, because we're going to see fights over dwindling water supplies and food. There'll be millions of refugees, crashing borders. There'll be conflicts over the food and the water. We'll be devoting more resources to conflict management and to disaster cleanup if we don't quickly turn down the heat. So that's what the leaders are beginning to bring this into focus. I believe that we need something like the National Security Council, where the heads of state from the leading countries come together to address the climate emergency. So this is President Biden, this is leaders in Europe, this is key Africa leaders like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and of course President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. You got to get the big players, the key countries of the G20, to come together and say, we are all in this together, and we can't solve this on our own. This needs a multilateral solution, and that's going to be the key, is to move it up to the head of state level while we still have time to respond.
And then just lastly, if you can give me just an overview, your thoughts on restoration in particular.
Well, so we need the three, to win these three races: the sprint to cut the super pollutants in the next decade or sooner. We need to win we need to win the marathon to 2050 to decarbonize and shift to clean energy. And then we need to win the ultra marathon to restore the climate to a safe and stable state. And many of the solutions for restoration, help us on the way to stabilizing and slowing down the feedbacks and avoiding the tipping points today. So it's a question of how far do you keep going? And the ones that I'm most familiar with and work on are methane. So methane mitigation coupled with methane removal. Absolutely brilliant and critical. Probably the most important way to slow near-term warming, slow the feedbacks, and avoid as many of the tipping points as we can. I won't say probably. It is indeed the most important strategy for doing that. Then there's work by companies like Blue Planet Cement. And I first met the founder and CEO, Brent Constance, at a Club of Madrid meeting maybe 10 or 15 years ago, quite some time ago. And I was so impressed with his presentation that I got to know him, and I asked him if I could put together a team of experts to vet his technology. So I assembled a group that included the head of the chemistry department at a major university, Nobel laureate Mario Molina, cement experts from around the world. And we had access to all of the science and the technology, not the financial information, but everything else. And after a 6-month review, we determined this technology was doing exactly what Brent said it was. It was capturing CO2 from the smokestack of the power plant at Moss Landing and turning it into cement products. So this is a brilliant technology, and it needs to go to scale as quickly as possible. I am an advisor to Blue Planet, along with Dan Tagdalini, former head of Government Services Administration for the Obama administration, their purchasing agency, and Leonardo DiCaprio as well. And Leo doesn't come to many of our meetings, but I know he's there in spirit. And so companies like Brent's are part of how we're going to do climate restoration. And there are others that, you know, with what we might do with the oceans, what we might do with kelp. You know, these are things that we need to invest in, and we need to perfect and bring to scale as quickly as we can.
And I promise this is the last question. Just on a personal note, what do you think about at night? Where are you in terms of the knowledge that you have and the predictions that you share? In your heart, how do you feel?
Well, you know, I study climate science obsessively. I mean, I every day I'm reading the latest papers, trying to keep up and confirm my understanding. A lot of people learned their climate science 5 or 10 years ago, and people thought at that point that CO2 or carbon dioxide was the only thing we needed to focus on. And that's not true. And so I want to be on that cutting edge of understanding. And then I also want to study the technologies. Like, it's one thing to diagnose the illness, it's the other to find the cure. So I spend time every day finding the latest, the newest, trying to find what I can be confident in can protect us in the future in the time that we have. How do we turn the heat down in the remaining time, which is very, very short? So I often relate a scene from a Woody Allen movie where his character dies. I think it might have been named Alvy Singer. And at the funeral, some guy comes in and sits down, and he turns to the guy next to him and says, "You were Alvy's psychiatrist, weren't you?" The guy says, "Yeah." He says, "Could you tell me how he died?" He says, "Well, his delusional mechanism failed him. He saw the world too clearly, and it killed him." So I spend a lot of time keeping my delusional mechanism strong, keeping my optimism that we still can pull this rabbit out of a hat, slow warming in time, and keep the planet relatively safe.
There's I promise this is the last one.
It's all right, keep going. I'm happy to.
Cut real quick.
Yeah.
Just getting that.
No, I think it is true that we're seeing climate anxiety, climate depression, you know, and this is a very unfortunate thing because anxiety and depression, you know, put you on the couch and take away your energy for solutions. So we need to point the path through the mountains here for the young people especially. Here is a way to keep the planet safe. Now let's join forces and kick people out of office who don't see what should be done and don't act fast enough. So a lot of this is about political organizing, and it can be done. You know, it's sometimes a little bit boring. It always requires incredible hard work and long hours. Find the good folks, get them into office, and get rid of the climate deniers and those who want to go too slow. So there are a lot of people who say, yeah, we need to solve climate change. Let's do it tomorrow. You know, the world is getting richer every day, and so we'll have more money to spend on climate solutions tomorrow. Classical economist response. Totally wrong. Every single moment that we wait, we add more irreversible impacts. We melt a little more of the sea ice. We melt a little more of the Greenland ice sheet. We damage the Amazon a little more. And so it's imperative that we slam on the brakes as fast as we possibly can, and then learn how to put the system into reverse. do climate restoration. I mean, climate restoration is just such an intuitive concept. The climate is out of whack. Let's restore it to the right safety and stability that we've known throughout human history. We can do that. So it's the right framing. It's very empowering. And I think young people will especially be attracted to that approach.
That's great, thank you.
You're welcome.